Al-Bashir, your source of Islamic literature, presents Envy, or Al-Hasad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Amma ba'd. One thing that is very common today in many of the mosques and many of the lectures, and even what is being written about, has to do with the current plight of the Muslim Ummah. And actually these kind of lectures have been going on for decades. It's not something new. And therefore, given the plight, given the wars, the violence, the terrorism, everything that is going on with respect to the Muslim Ummah today, it may sound a little unnecessary or a little strange to all of a sudden concentrate on a topic like hasad, which is our topic in these lectures, hasad or envy. But actually the extreme importance of this topic cannot be denied. If we go to the Quran and Sunnah, we see that the Quran and Sunnah discusses and refers to the issue of hasad on many occasions and demonstrates to us the importance of this concept. So if the importance of this concept can be confirmed in the Quran and Sunnah, this is something for the Muslim to wake up and realize that indeed this is an issue which is of extreme importance. So first and foremost, we have the fact that it is something stressed in the Quran and Sunnah, and so therefore we have to take it seriously. And secondly also, and this is something inshallah we'll develop further as we will also develop the first point further in the lectures, but it is a disease, hasad or envy, is a disease that is very prevalent among the Muslim Ummah today. And unfortunately it is prevalent among even the scholars, even the jama'at, even the people, the du'at, even the people who are working for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can find this disease existing among them. And even among the common people, even in some remote villages where you don't expect maybe this kind of disease to be so rampant, we find it existing throughout. And finally, another thing which points to the extreme importance of this topic is that the hasad or envy is something that is related to the heart and the role of the heart and the actions of the heart. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and know that Allah revives the earth after its death. Part of that, obviously, we know that this can be a reference to the fact that we will be resurrected and we'll have to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore we have to be awake, we have to awaken now and change ourselves before that time. But it also is a clue to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change, can revive our hearts. If we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely, then inshallah in the same way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revives the land after it is dead, then inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will revive our hearts. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran in the words of Ibrahim, يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. The day when wealth and sons avail not anyone save him who brings unto Allah a sound heart. And in fact, when you think about it, the heart is actually the master, you can say, of the rest of the body. The rest of the body, the actual physical acts that you do, the things that you do in this physical world are the result of the commands that come from the heart. So the heart is the commander and the limbs and the body are like the soldiers. So therefore, if the heart is good, then the thing that the body will do will be good and everything will be good. But if the heart is evil, if the heart is rotten, then the thing that the body will do will be evil. And in fact, it is essential. It is essential that we always have some kind of feeling about the state of our heart. That we always are kind of keeping an eye on, if I may say it like that, keeping an eye on our hearts and what is going on with our hearts. Because we cannot simply rest on our laurels and say, alhamdulillah, I am Muslim and I am satisfied, nothing is going to happen to me or anything of that nature. No, in fact, the heart, even by its definition in the Arabic language, qalb, it is very clear that the heart can be swayed. It can be moved. So we have to be very concerned about what is happening with respect to our hearts. Now, again, if the person is not wise in seeing what's going on and therefore repent and changes his ways to remove that effect of that sin, if he's not aware of it, then that weakness in the heart can lead to another sin, which again affects the heart, which leads to maybe a greater sin, which again affects the heart, which leads to a greater sin and so forth, to the point that the heart can be completely sealed and rusted. The Prophet ﷺ has told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say on the Day of Judgment, where are those who loved one another for my sake, due to my greatness? Today I shall shade them under my shade, a day in which there will be no shade other than my shade. In another narration of this hadith, found in Tirmidhi, the first one was from Sahih Muslim, and the one from Tirmidhi, the Prophet ﷺ has told us, يقول رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال الله المتحابون في جلال لهم منابر من نور يغبطهم النبيون وشهداء. The Prophet ﷺ has told us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that those who love each other for his sake, due to his greatness, they will have minbars of light. We're talking about in the hereafter, they'll have minbars of light that the prophets and the martyrs would wish that they would have. So there is a special reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that goes to the people who have certain acts of worship. They're fulfilling certain acts of worship in their hearts. And one of the reasons, as some scholars point out, why the reward is greater for the acts of the heart, and that is because in reality the acts of the heart, the deeds of worship that are done by the heart, are actually greater and more difficult than the outward deeds. You see, when you think about the outward deeds, like even the salat, even those people who have no iman in their hearts whatsoever, the hypocrites, for example, and people who are very weak of faith, they can pray, right? They can pray, they can fast, even if they don't really have much iman in their hearts. They may pray or fast even for completely the wrong reasons, right? Just to be seen, or just because of communal pressure or whatsoever. So anyone can do the outward acts. The outward act can be performed by anyone. Even we have sometimes disbelievers going to make Hajj just to see what the Hajj is like and to write about the Hajj and so forth. So those things can be done by anyone, but only the true servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, only those who are truly dedicated to and love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're the only ones who can do the actions of the heart, the actions of worship of the heart. Anyone can do the physical deeds, but the real worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the heart can only be done by those who are truly pious, who are truly devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, of course, the first step in understanding hasad is to understand what it means. What is the definition of the word hasad? For example, Immanuel Kant, he believed that envy was a natural impulse inherent in the nature of man. Now, in his case, though, he said that if it is manifested, then it becomes an abominable vice. So he's saying that it's something in the nature of man, inherent in the nature of man. I guess you cannot find anyone who will not have it. But so the existence of it, he's saying, is not in itself necessarily bad. But when it is manifested, then it becomes something. Then it becomes a vice. Talking about man in general, he says, because they feel unhappy, men cannot bear the sight of someone they think is happy. He said it is where a person hates to see anyone else being superior or better off than him. It is where a person hates to see anyone else being superior or better off than him. So if you see someone with more money, you see someone with more status, you see something with more knowledge, this is something that your soul, this is something that your nafs cannot stand. To see this other person in a situation where he is better off than you. So this hatred for that thing and this feeling in your heart towards that thing, this is how Ibn Rajab defines hasad. Al-Bugha and Musto and also Abdul-Malik al-Qasim, contemporary authors, they define al-hasad simply as the wishing that another person would lose a bounty that he possesses. So Ibn Rajab said that it is that you dislike that anyone has, for example, a bounty or has in some ways better off than you are. So from right here, by the way, just from this basic definition, you can see how hasad is going to be something evil because, number one, it implies hatred in your heart. It implies wishing some kind of harm for somebody else. So you not only dislike that the person has this thing, but you also wish, according to Ibn al-Qayyim and these other scholars, you also wish that they would lose that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن تَمْسَسْكُمْ حَسَنَةٌ تَسُؤْهُمْ وَإِن تُصِبْكُمْ سَيِّئَةٌ يَفْرَحُوا بِهَا. That if a good befalls you, it grieves them. But if some evil overtakes you, they rejoice at it. And this goes back to what Ibn Jibreen said and what Al-Muhasibi said. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, neither those who disbelieve among the people of the book, nor the polytheists, like that there should be sent down unto you any good from your Lord. But Allah chooses for His mercy whom He wills. And Allah is the owner of great bounty. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has given them that bounty. But from the Sharia point of view, if you dislike that someone has received something, then this could be, or actually this is, as Ibn Rajab said, this is sinful, because it is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has bestowed that bounty on someone. So you're not just going against chance or going against some kind of random thing that somehow this person has received it, but you are actually going against the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are disliking something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has determined and has decreed. The hasad has a lot to do with perception, a lot to do with an individual's perception. In other words, he's seeing other people as possessing something, and he's seeing somebody else as being happy, while in reality that may not be the case. But the only thing that is important from the envious person's point of view is, as I said, what he perceives, what he thinks is going on. And this will drive him to the kind of feeling that he has. Probably an envious person, if he, for example, sees that somebody else has some kind of bounty, and then he's able to destroy that bounty, and then he finds that the person is just as happy or maybe even happier than when he had the bounty, I'm sure that envious person would probably get even more upset. So it's not just the object itself, but there is also this aspect of trying to bring some kind of harm, trying to bring some kind of unhappiness to others that is reflected at least in some level of al-hasad. Desiring something or wishing that maybe something would be easier or better for you. This is not envy, as long as you are not targeting something that other people possess. In other words, you're not saying, for example, that these people have the youth, and as the old expression says, youth is always wasted on the young. That if you had the youth and energy, you would do good things with it, and these kids are just goofing off and wasting all their energy on useless things. But you're not targeting their youth. You're not saying, I wish they would lose their youth or something of that nature. But you just wish that you had certain qualities that you could use and benefit from. So what we find, for example, is that sometimes the feeling of al-hasad will be very strong in the heart of a person. So sometimes the feeling of al-hasad is strong in the heart. Now the question is, what does the person do based on that feeling in the heart? See, some people go now beyond that feeling in the heart and now try to actively remove that bounty from the other person. Maybe without destroying the bounty itself sometimes, but at least removing it from that person that they feel envious towards. So they have the feeling in the heart and they actually act upon it to try to remove that bounty or try to destroy that bounty. Now on another level, there are many times in which the hasad which is in the heart, that feeling which is in the heart, is not acted upon. Okay, and this is very important. And to distinguish between the two cases is obviously very important as well. There are times in which that feeling in the heart is not acted upon. A shaitan can come to anyone and put all kinds of thoughts into the person's mind. Right? Even thoughts of shirk and kufr, as we see from different hadith. Even thoughts of shirk and kufr, a shaitan can come to you and put these thoughts into your mind. And so the important thing is one of the important things I should say, is what you then do with that feeling. What you then do with those thoughts. How do you react to those thoughts? So for example, sometimes we know that there is a feeling of hasad in the heart. We know that we have this feeling towards someone, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them something, and we are upset that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them something. We do not like it, that person has it, and in our hearts and our minds what we're thinking is we would be very happy if that would be destroyed. As I said, alhamdulillah, this is a different case now. It's not like the first case where it gets to the point where you actually work to remove it. But in your heart, actually, even though you take no step necessarily to remove it, in your heart, you know that actually if that bounty were destroyed, you would be very happy. You wouldn't have any problem with that whatsoever. So now the question is, what does the person do? Obviously, by the way, and this is points to the importance of knowledge. The first thing is to recognize what this feeling is. I know that's obvious, but sometimes we have to emphasize the obvious. Because you have to recognize that this feeling is this disease of al-hasad. You have to recognize that this is that very dangerous thing that so many scholars, even non-Muslim authorities, are talking about and warning people about. If you don't have knowledge, if you don't study what is al-hasad, if you don't even hear about al-hasad, you may not even recognize what a dangerous disease is in your heart. So you have to recognize what is going on in your heart. Once we recognize what is going on in the heart, now there are a number of things that might be done. One person, for example, may recognize what is in his heart, recognize that this is a great disease, and will take whatever steps he can to counter it and to remove it from his heart. He will turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He'll make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify his heart. He will pray. He'll do whatever he thinks will help him to remove this from his heart. Obviously, that is how the believer who is really aware of the diseases of his heart and how he'll have to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with these diseases in his heart if he dies in that state. Obviously, the one who is really aware of the place of the heart and the central role of the heart and the worship of the heart, this is how he will react. He will not waste any time to try his best to remove this from his heart. Turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, the stronger that he tries to counter it, the more that he takes these efforts, even though this thing is entered in his heart, by his reaction, by the steps that he is taking, inshallah, he will be pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help him and will remove this from his heart. Obviously, al-hasad, the feelings of al-hasad could enter into anybody's heart and anybody's mind. So if it does enter into somebody's mind, and let's say he does not take any steps, he does not act upon that feeling, is this also a sin, or what is his situation in such a case? So Al-Hasan al-Basri one time said, cover or conceal al-hasad in your heart, for it will not harm you as long as it does not go upon your tongue or you act upon it by your hands. And Al-Fudayl Ibn Iyad also said the cure for al-hasad is its concealment. Here the point that they're both making, although more explicitly by Al-Hasan al-Basri, is that if you feel it in your heart, then conceal it, keep it there. Don't let it affect your speech, don't let it affect your actions, and then inshallah it will not cause any harm to you. Once it moves on to actions that you do, whether something you say or something you do, obviously, then this comes to a different level, and this will be without any question a sin. Now, one of the bases for this view is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ recorded by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَجَاوَزَ عَنْ أُمَّتِي مَا حَدَّثَتْ بِهِ أَنفُسَهَا مَا لَمْ تَعْمَلْ أو تَتَكَلَّمْ. Verily, Allah has overlooked for my ummah what their souls think about, as long as they do not act on it or speak about it. And that is why Ibn al-Qayyim says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not tell us to seek refuge of the envious one, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to seek refuge of the envious one when he is being envious. Right? From the verse in the Quran, وَمِن شَرِّ حَاسِدٍ إِذَا حَسَدٍ. From the evil of the envious one when he envies. So when someone conceals al-hasad in his heart, this means that he dislikes this feeling of al-hasad. So once he dislikes this feeling of al-hasad and tries to conceal it, then yes, definitely, there's no question, inshallah, that he will not be blameworthy. Al-Muhasibi points out that this is, if you have that feeling in your heart towards someone, even if you don't act upon it, but you enjoying that feeling and you have no problem with that feeling in your heart, Al-Muhasibi said this is a sin between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everyone has to be honest with themselves. Okay, because envy can exist in the heart, as we said, envy can enter into anybody's heart, but as long as the person is not speaking upon it or acting upon it, then he is not necessarily harming anybody else. Now, what this last group of people do, and it's described by many of the ulama who discuss this concept of al-hasad, and what distinguishes this group of people and what sets them apart as one of the best groups of people, is that because of that feeling of al-hasad, they try to counter that feeling of al-hasad by turning towards that person that they envied, and treat them in the best possible fashion. So now we're talking about a situation where al-hasad has entered the heart. The person has not acted, has not spoken based on it, but because he knows that he has had that feeling in his heart, to completely counter that feeling in his heart and to make sure that there's no negative ramifications that have come from that feeling in them, they make sure that they deal with that person for whom they had envy in the best possible way. They will make dua for that person. Imagine that, and see what a great step this is. You feel hasad towards someone, you want to make sure that this hasad is not a sin, you try to control it in your heart. One of the best things that you can do, inshallah, to really make sure that there's no sin upon you because of this feeling of hasad, if you really want to make sure, then you deal with that person for whom you felt this hasad for, you deal with him in a special way. You make sure to be nice to him, and you make dua for him, because this is the most, if you want to really do an act which is sincere between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other person has no idea that you felt this hasad towards him. And so now you're doing an act which is just between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Only you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that this hasad has entered in your heart. You do this act purely between yourself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you sincerely make dua for the other person. So this is one of the best steps that you can take. This will inshallah make sure or guarantee that any feeling of al-hasad that you might have had in your heart, inshallah, is going to be removed by this dua that you make for the other person. And in addition to that, you speak well of the other person, you speak well of the bounties that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given that other person, and you make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues to bless him and blesses him in particular for that bounty or those bounties for which you had hasad. This, some of the writers said, this category of people, these are among the people of the highest level of faith, and they fulfill the requirement of iman, that they love for their brothers what they love for themselves. There's a number of lessons that we can get from these examples, from the Quranic examples in particular. First of all, we see that al-hasad is a characteristic of the greatest evil creation that there is. We see that al-hasad is a characteristic of a shaitan. This fact in itself, I would hope, would lead many people, many Muslims or any believer, to try to free himself from this disease. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us not to follow in the footsteps of a shaitan. He is to you an avowed or a clear enemy. Not to follow in his footsteps, and obviously not to emulate and not to become like this shaitan. So this is when we have the feeling of al-hasad, when we find this disease within our hearts, we should think to ourselves that who are we behaving like? Are we behaving like the believers? Are we behaving like the prophets? Or are we actually behaving like a shaitan? So this al-hasad, as we said, this is something that usually occurs between people who are close, either close in age, close in either, like we said, brothers and sisters, sibling relationship, close in status, these kind of things. So, and what this means also is that if it can happen between brothers and sisters, it also can happen among close friends. So when you think of al-hasad, when you think about people whom you should be willing to harm the least, those people who you really don't want to harm, those people who are closest to you, these are the people whom you may end up harming the most because of your hasad. So this is another point, that if you were to think about it, this should keep you from allowing this disease to be in your heart, because it may end up harming the people who are closest to you and who actually you should have the best relationship with, not going out and trying to harm them. So this shows you this feeling of competitiveness, which many times is close to al-hasad. You just want to make sure that you are better off than those people around you. So when those people around you are getting better off, then this is when you start feeling resentment in your heart. And you don't want those people around you to be better off than you. Even though they're your friends, maybe they're even your brothers and your sisters and your relatives, you don't want them to be better off than you. And if they are, then this feeling of al-hasad comes to you. And oftentimes what this results in is that if then some harm comes to them, you do start feeling some kind of pleasure. In fact, one philosopher, he said that in the misfortune of our best friends, we always find something that is not displeasing to us. In the misfortune of our best friends, we always find something that is not displeasing to us. This is a real disease. Okay? This is a real disease in the heart. One of the aspects of al-hasad is that it leads to other sins. So al-hasad in itself is a sin, but it can also lead to many other sins. One of them is hatred of your brother Muslim. For example, it can also lead to greed and other things. So al-hasad in itself is evil, and it can also lead to many other destructive evils in the heart as well. Not just actual acts that you do based on al-hasad, but also other diseases of the heart. Obviously, from a societal point of view, al-hasad can be something very destructive. And one of the clear signs that we get from the Quran is that al-hasad can be a cause for division and sectarianism, the division of humankind as a whole, and unfortunately also, as we'll speak about, the division amongst the Muslims and amongst the believers themselves. And this is the antithesis of what the Islamic society and what the Muslim society should be like. The Muslim society should be united and together and supporting one another. So al-hasad strikes at the root of that, but not just in the sense of hatred as we talked about last time, but really in the sense of division to the point that the different members of that society no longer feel that they are really part of the same society or the same ummah or the same people. And we have to realize that power and leadership, positions of authority and esteem and so forth, these are great trials from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are great trials from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are things that some people dearly, dearly love. They want to have these things for themselves. They have to be the center of attention. They have to be the center of authority. And so therefore, if they are not given that attention, if they're not given that respect, if they're not given that authority, inside they cannot stand that other people are given that authority and position and so forth. And so therefore, immediately they become envious of those people who are given that position of authority and respect that they so greatly desire. And that desire in their heart, which in effect, in itself is a disease, can easily lead to the greater and more harmful disease of hasad, of envy. And the disease of hasad and envy can many times be acted upon, where the person actively goes out to destroy the others who were given positions of authority and leadership instead. And in fact, this disease of hasad even reaches those people, or I should say can even reach those people who you would really wish were above this disease of hasad. And that is al-ulama, the scholars, and the du'at, those people who are calling to. Ibn Abbas was one of the first people to mention that the ulama, the scholars, are those people who are easily jealous, or easily envious, I should say. That this is a disease that if they are not careful about themselves and do not attach a great deal of taqwa with their knowledge, they do not attach a great deal of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is bestowing upon them, then it becomes easy for hasad or this envy to enter into their heart. Because when you think about knowledge, and when you think about the ulama, the scholars, basically, their whole worth, what they mean to others, is based on their knowledge and their level of knowledge. However, knowledge is such, as we see, for example, in the story of Musa and Khidr, knowledge is such that no one actually has all of the knowledge. And no matter how knowledgeable someone might be, no matter how great of a scholar someone might be, there's going to be some areas of ilm that they are going to be either defective or they'll not have as much knowledge in those areas of ilm as somebody else. That is the nature of ilm, even Islamic knowledge, even the knowledge of the Sharia. No one can be an expert in every different aspect of the Sharia to the point that he knows more about these different aspects than anybody else. You might even find someone, for example, who does a PhD in one aspect of the Sharia, and maybe that's all that he really knows about. But he has studied in great deal that aspect to the point that he is now an expert in that. And his expertise maybe is greater than some of the greatest ulama and scholars that we know. And that is the nature of knowledge. And so therefore, the scholar always has to recognize the fact that no matter how much knowledge he has, no matter how much knowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed him with, there are things that he does not know. Because if your ultimate goal is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're working for an organization that is working to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and other Muslims are working in other organizations for the sake of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if that is your ultimate goal and you always keep in mind that ultimate goal, then no matter where the good comes from, whether it comes from you personally or another member of your group or your group as a whole or another group of Muslims or even another Muslim who you don't care that much for personally or whatever the case might be, you will be happy because it is something pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If that is your ultimate goal, and that goal is always, you always keep that in mind above everything else, then anytime you see something which you would conclude is something pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will be happy. You will be happy and you'll be pleased with that regardless of whether that has come from your hand or from the hands of your close friend or from the hands of your organization or from the hands of an organization that you consider some kind of rival or something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it very clear that it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who determines what anybody gets in this world. And this is something we all know. This is a basic of Aqidah, right? No one, this is not a shocking, inshallah, statement to anybody. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also in His Sharia has determined what certain individuals also should do. What is their obligation? What is their responsibility? What is their role in society and so forth. Keep in mind the fact that, there's a number of proverbs, number of sayings about al-hasad, that, the one who has envy, the one who has this disease in his heart, it's very easy for them to see that everybody else has a better life and everything they're enjoying is better. Right? The grass is always greener on the other side, as they say. A proverb states that envy turns a blade of grass into a palm tree. You are seeing, if you have this disease in your heart, one of the aspects of this disease in the heart, and maybe you can call this also one of the evils of this disease in the heart, is that it beclouds the mind and it distorts your vision. Once you allow this disease to enter in this heart, you feel like everybody else is enjoying life and everybody else is having prosperity and having good life while you are miserable. This is something very dangerous for your own psychological state, and this is another one of the evils of al-hasad. And in fact, as some scholars have pointed out, al-hasad, if it affects anybody, if al-hasad really causes harm to anybody, it causes harm to the person who has this disease. And this is one of the main ways in which it does this. It makes the person feel like everybody else is enjoying life, everybody else is getting all of these bounties, everybody else is in such a good state. Why is my life so miserable? While in reality, maybe everybody else's life is miserable too. Everybody's living a miserable life today. Maybe, who knows? Allahu Alam. There's so much stress, so much going on, especially within the Muslim community, all the things that we have to put up nowadays. Maybe everybody, except of course those people who have really iman in their hearts. Those people who really have iman in their hearts, inshallah, they are not having a bad life because of that iman. But that iman is open to everybody. Right? You don't have to have the bounties of this world to have that iman and have that tranquility in your heart. But as I was saying, that the problem occurs that when you have this feeling in your heart and you allow this feeling to exist, then you see everything through, as they say, these colored lenses that everybody else is enjoying and you are miserable. What's going to happen? By the way, what's going to be the result of that? You're going to feel miserable. Whether you were miserable or not from the beginning, and whether you are actually relatively miserable or not, you are going to feel miserable. So one of the early scholars, Al-Asma'i, he said that al-hasad is a fair disease. It is a just disease. It does more harm to the envious one than it does to the envied one. Yeah, many times you might be envious towards somebody else, and that person is happy and living a fine. He's not affected by your envy whatsoever. The only thing that is the result of your envy is your own misery. That person that you're envious of, maybe that person in the first place didn't even want this bounty. In fact, this bounty that the person received maybe is a bigger headache than anything else, or it's something that even he didn't even think about or didn't even want in the first place. And yet for you, it is a source of envy, and as we said, even worse, or the greatest problem with that, and the worst aspect of it, is that it is a hatred towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. When the ulama talk about fitna and being put into trials, many times they emphasize the fact that the trials of hardship are many times easier to face than the trials of ease. Because many times the trials of hardship, you have no choice but to be patient. If, Allah forbidding, you are put into prison, for example, and you are put into prison for years, and all you can do is just sit there and wait. There's not really much you can do. There's not even much you can do really even to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala under those circumstances, with respect to your situation, with respect to that trial that you're being put into. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests you or puts you to trial with ease, gives you, for example, $1 million, what are you going to do with that $1 million? Are you going to make israf? Are you going to waste the money? If you start making, for example, if your income jumps from $50,000 a year to $500,000 a year, all of a sudden now you're in a different company of people maybe. And this company of people, the rich, many times, many of the rich, they are doing things, na'udhu billah, I mean, it is just sick when you sometimes look at and read or study what the rich people are doing, especially in this day and age, in this civilized world. Maybe you start mixing with them and your whole deen, your whole faith is destroyed because of the company now that you're keeping. As you move up from one neighborhood to another, to richer and richer people, and maybe you move from people who are religious to people who are less and less religious, and more into fasad and more into evil. So you don't know why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept something from you, and you don't know maybe even what is the hidden bounty of not receiving a bounty. The hidden bounty of not receiving a bounty. Maybe keeping that from you was actually better for you in the long run. And not only that, it can be when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps something from you, there is a possibility for great reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if it is something that you need and you are patient, then this patience is a source of great reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have two choices in front of you. Either you can be envious or you can be patient. One is a disease that will harm you greatly and lead to the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the other is a source of great reward for you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we should strengthen our relationship between ourselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time not worry about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given others, especially not the things of this dunya. You know, more than one of the earliest scholars, for example Ibn Sirin and Ibn Zubair, they have been quoted as saying to the effect, as Ibn Sirin said, I have never felt envy toward anyone concerning a matter of this world. This is because if that person was from the people of paradise, he's from the people of Jannah, how can I be envious of him concerning something of this world when it is nothing compared to what he'll have in Jannah? And, he continued, if he was of the people of hell, how could I be envious of him concerning a matter of this world when he is going to the hell? Another aspect of envy, as we said, the only thing that envy does really is bring misery to your heart. Because in reality, you are not going to be able to change whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. If Allah has decreed that someone receives a bounty, then it's not going to be within your ability. Even if you work and strive and try to remove that bounty, it is not going to be within your ability unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it. Okay, so you are actually fighting a losing battle without any question. If you want that bounty to be removed or to be destroyed, it can only be actually removed or destroyed by the one who gave it to that person in the first place. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees to give it to him, there's nothing you can do about it. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees to remove it from that person, also there's nothing you can really do about it. Everything is within the command and within the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In addition, obviously, if you allow this disease of hasad to enter in your heart, well, think about this world. There are billions of bounties, especially nowadays, you know, in recent times. Things are changing every day. You can't even keep up with what's new, the latest technology, the latest fashion, this and this. I mean, it's a day-to-day thing nowadays. So if you allow a hasad to enter into your heart, where is this hasad going to end? Because there's billions of things in this life. Are you going to have hasad towards every kind of bounty in this life? And if your hasad is with respect to one thing nowadays, now or today, tomorrow it's going to be with something else and so forth. So the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يجتمعان في قلب عبد الإيمان والحسد. The Prophet ﷺ said that iman, faith, real faith and belief, and al-hasad, envy, do not gather together in the heart of a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I would like to mention one of the signs that you have this disease of hasad in your heart. This was mentioned by Ibn Uthaymeen, and at least the way I understand it, this is if you ask me, it is a subtle sign. That is, that it will occur to someone and he may not realize that this is hasad. But Ibn Uthaymeen points out that this is one of the strong signs. In his case, he said it's one of the strong signs. I believe it's more of a kind of a subtle sign, that if you have this is a sign that your heart is inflicted with the disease of al-hasad. And what he says is that when a person tries to conceal the virtues and the goodness of others, when he does not like it when others talk about the virtues of another person and the good that another person, when he remains silent and pretends like he does not know the goodness of the other person or the virtues of the others or the good things that the other person has done, Ibn Uthaymeen said that this is a sign that he has hasad in his heart. Because a true believer, the person who does not have hasad in his heart, he likes it when good things are said about others. He likes it when love is spread about others. He likes it when good deeds are appreciated and so forth. So therefore he himself, when he speaks about others, he speaks in a good way and he praises them and he appreciates the good that they've done. So once a person is no longer appreciative and is trying to hide the good that other people do and is not willing to admit the good things that other people are doing, this is a sign, this should be a kind of wake-up call in his heart that there's something going on in this. That there must be some, as I said, Ibn Uthaymeen says it's a strong sign, I think more of it of a subtle sign. There must be some kind of hasad, must be some kind of disease that is going on in his heart. So this should be something, as I said, this should be some kind of a wake-up call. Don't take this kind of thing lightly. Now, probably, as we spoke about before, probably this disease, this feeling of al-hasad is going to enter maybe everybody's heart or everybody's mind at one time or another. We mentioned that. You know, you might have a friend of yours, for example, that you have this envy towards, you have this feeling of hasad towards, and so therefore, in subtle ways, you don't treat him as well as you should. You're not as polite to him as you should be. When you meet him, you don't smile in the way that you should smile. You know, you meet someone else who you don't have that feeling of hasad, and you are like, Assalamu alaikum, how are you doing, what's happening, and so forth. And with somebody else that you have this feeling of hasad, you say Assalamu alaikum, you smile, but the real feeling isn't there. It's like a cold, or it has some coldness to it. And you might even think maybe it's not much. You might not even pay attention to it because you have that feeling of hasad in your heart, so you don't really care that you're not treating that other person that well. And this is obviously, you know, one of the main problems is that it causes you to behave in this way, and you are in your heart, you're justifying it. That person got this and doesn't deserve it, and so therefore I'm going to treat that person in this way. The other person may notice it. May notice that when you meet him, you don't quite treat him like you treat others. So you're hurting the other person's feelings. Other people, by the way, may also notice it. How come this person, when he meets that person, he doesn't really treat him very well? And they may understand it as a disease on your part, and so therefore they will not love you and they will not feel towards you as you would like them to feel towards you. Because you have the right, for example, if someone is treating you incorrectly, if someone is doing you wrong, or someone is doing haram things, something, you have the right to be upset for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe not so much for your own personal, you know, you should, when it comes to your own personal issues, if someone is doing you wrong, it is good for you to be forgiving and to overlook it. Inshallah, you'll get the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if someone is doing someone is doing wrong, if someone is treating others wrong, if someone is doing some kind of injustice towards others and so forth, then you have the right, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to hate what that person is doing, to lessen your feeling of brotherhood towards that person because of that person's lack of proper behavior towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The person that you are doing this act towards is actually an innocent person, right? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him some bounty and blessed him with some bounty, especially if he did not get it through haram means, let's forget about that case of getting something through haram means, for example. He got it through halal means, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him that bounty. And now you are attacking him either in your heart or you know, by taking steps against him. You are now taking steps or attacking an innocent person. You are making hasad for something of this dunya, something of this world, which again, there's not much real bounty and much benefit in these things of this world. Right? There's no reason to kill yourself over some bounty of this world. The real bounty is the bounty of the hereafter. So there's no reason for you to be so upset about the bounties of this life. And at the same time, by having this hasad in your heart, you are actually displeasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you are perhaps removing from yourself the real bounties of the hereafter. You know, in a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ has recommended to us that we should look to those people who are less fortunate than us, than looking to those people who are more fortunate. You know, those people who have been given less of this world. We should look to those people and think about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. When you think about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you, then you become thankful towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and instead of being upset about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not given you, you become thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. So instead of becoming envious, you become thankful and grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You should also think about, on the other hand, you should also think about what is going to be the punishment that you may receive from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing this hasad to be in your heart. Again, when we talk about the disease of hasad, in reality what we're saying, we're not talking about that fleeting feeling that may come into your heart. What we're talking about, a feeling that you allow to implant itself in your heart. As we know from the Quran, the reward or the result of a deed is similar in nature to the deed itself. So if you do good, inshallah, you will have something good similar to it in return. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ كَسَبُوا سَيِّئَاتِ جَزَاءُ سَيِّئَاتٍ بِمِثْلِهَا وَتَرْحَقُهُمْ ذِلَّةٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, and those who have earned evil deeds, those who did evil deeds, the recompense of an evil deed is the like thereof, and humiliating disgrace will cover them. So what is it that envy is? Envy really is the desire for the bounties to be removed from other people. This is what envy is. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, due to this evil that you're committing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to reward you or recompense you with a similar evil to the evil that you are committing, what do you think it'll be? I don't have the answer to that question, actually. Okay, this is just conjecture on my part. But if it is going to be similar to the evil that you're committing, maybe what it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to remove bounties. If you want bounties to be removed from others, and that is the sin that you're committing, maybe the result is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to remove some of the bounties that He's given you. And of course, the worst one and the end result, if you continue to wish evil upon others and have this malice towards others for what they have, then the end result is maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will even remove the essence of iman from your heart as a result of this hasad. So Ibn al-Qayyim also in a passage in Al-Fawaid, he says, for example, that all sorts of character and qualities, and this is what I alluded to earlier, they have certain limits to them, and if those limits are exceeded, the person is doing something wrong. So when those limits are exceeded, they are exceeded either by going beyond the furthest limit or not even reaching the minimum, right? In either case, you are committing an error. So now let's take this concept and apply it to al-hasad. Apply it to the idea of looking towards others and seeing what they have and having a feeling that you would like to be like them or have what they have. So if you see others, for example, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them, as in this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, has blessed them with knowledge or has blessed them with wealth, and they are using those things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in other words, they are earning the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now if you can see that and have no feeling in your heart that that's what you would like to be like, that you admire them and wish you could be like them and would like to do those things that they are doing, if you do not have that feeling in your heart at all, and this is a kind of hasad, we can call it hasad. The Prophet ﷺ has called it hasad, so we can refer to it as hasad. And this is, as some scholars spoke about it, this is the obligatory hasad on the heart. Because at the very least, you should want to be like those people who are obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they are pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you can see these people, regardless of how much actually wealth and how much knowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, but they are acting upon it and they are using it properly. And you look at yourself, for example, and you see that you're not doing it, or you're not doing it like them, or even if you are doing it to some extent, but you do not feel in your heart that you would like to be like them and actually do those things which are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this means that there is some problem in your heart. You are not reaching the minimum level of feeling, and even of this feeling of what we can call hasad, that should be in your heart. So if you can see people obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you don't even care that you are similar to them at all, and you can see them and it doesn't even matter to you whether you're like them or not, or you have no feeling that you wish you could be doing the same things that they are doing, this is definitely a sign that there is a problem in your heart. This is definitely a sign that there is a problem in your heart. Because you do not even have enough iman to stir your heart with the feeling that you wish you could be like them. You wish you could be doing the acts of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they are doing. This is not a matter to be taken lightly. This means you are missing some minimum emotions in your heart. Now if you take this feeling and go too far and apply it to things where it doesn't belong, like the things of this dunya and so forth, that is the evil hasad that we've been talking about. You definitely want to avoid that, because that is a disease. But at the same time, you have to have a minimum, right? And it is interesting to look in this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and to see what the Prophet ﷺ has identified as the places wherein you can make hasad. What is hasad with respect to? And the Prophet ﷺ, again in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا حسد إلا في اثنتين رجل أتاه الله مالا فسلط على هلكته في الحق وآخر أتاه الله حكمة فهو يقضي بها ويعلمها. There is to be no hasad except with respect to two: a person to whom Allah has given wealth and he uses it up for the purposes of truth, and another man whom Allah has given wisdom and judges by it and teaches it. But think about this hadith. Every human being, or I should say maybe virtually every human being, has been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala some level of wealth and some level of knowledge. SubhanAllah. Think about this hadith. There's no hasad except for these two categories of people. And then the Prophet ﷺ described two categories of people for which everyone actually can emulate them. Maybe if someone has the latest, the most expensive car, the nicest, biggest house, you can never be like them. But you can be like the person whom Allah has given wealth and Allah has given knowledge, and he's using the wealth in the proper way and he's using the knowledge in the proper way. You can be like them. So this is not a self-defeating hasad. This is not a kind of hasad that is going to lead to misery on the part of the one who has this hasad. But instead, this can be something to encourage the person with hasad, to drive him to do what the other person he's admiring is doing, and so therefore become just like the other person. So if you cannot actually be from the scholars or the students of knowledge, then at least you should have love for them. At least you should have love for them, and inshallah that will benefit you. So the love for them will benefit you. And then he said that if you cannot love them, at least don't hate them, because if you cannot benefit from your love for them, at least do not commit a sin by hating these people who are working for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and who are learning for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they are passing on this deen. And this is where the believers compete with one another in acts of righteousness and getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not an aspect of hasad whatsoever. Okay, at least this is not an aspect of the evil hasad whatsoever, at least I should say. This is not the disease, but this is the willingness or the desire in a person's heart to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to go beyond how others are pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the drive behind this is actually a desire to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even more than others are pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not to be satisfied with the fact that you know that others are pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than you are pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the drive behind this, the motivating factor, is not that you are unhappy about what others are doing, but it is completely and solely related to you and your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the best of your ability. And so if you are seeing others doing more than you, that makes you feel like therefore you can do more. If another human being who's similar to you is doing more than you, this should be assigned to you, or could be assigned to you, of course given other factors, but this could be assigned to you, that you are not doing the most that you can do to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you want to compete so that you will know, inshallah, or you'll do your best to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the best that you possibly can. So as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, in Surah Al-Mutaffifin, وَفِي ذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ, talking about the rewards and Jannah and so forth. And for this, let those who want to strive compete. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, سابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم وجنة عرضها كعرض السماء والأرض أعدت للذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, race one with another and hastening towards forgiveness from your Lord and towards paradise, the width whereof is as the width of heaven and earth, prepared for those who believe in Allah and His messengers. That is the grace of Allah which He bestows on whom He pleases, and Allah is the owner of great bounty. Ibn Rajab noted that when this verse was revealed, the Sahaba understood from that they should strive to be the first to perform the noble deeds. And so therefore, if they found that they were lagging behind others, or others did noble deeds before them, this saddened them. This saddened them because they knew that other people were doing good deeds before them. This saddened them because they knew that they did not take the initiative and try to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before other people try to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Al-Hasan al-Basri said that if you see someone competing with you for this world, then compete with him for the hereafter. Don't worry about competing for this world, but turn your attention to competing with others for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now obviously there are some important points that we have to keep in mind with respect to this kind of competition. As we said, it is a healthy competition. And the first key point with respect to this type of competition of racing towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that one never has the feeling in his heart that he wants the goodness for himself and excel others while others do not get it. You know, this is not part of the competition at all. You are happy for your brothers actually when you compete and they do well. You are happy for them because this is actually part of your iman. You are saddened that you cannot please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala better than them, but you have a feeling of happiness in your heart that someone did the act for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your brother or sister in Islam was able to do it. Okay, so there is never a feeling of resentment towards anyone who did the deeds. There's never a feeling of resentment that the deed was done but it wasn't done at your hand. This is absolutely and positively absent in this kind of positive competition. Because the goal is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased whether you do the act or if somebody else beats you to it and does it. For example, if it's an act that only one person can do. And we want to move on now to the concept of al-ithar. Al-ithar. And this al-ithar, when you begin to understand al-ithar, which is the concept of sacrificing for the sake of one's brother in Islam or one's sister, when you begin to understand this concept, you can really understand how distant hasad is from Islam, the negative or the disease of hasad, because you can think of al-ithar as virtually the exact opposite of al-hasad. In al-hasad you are upset when others get something, while in ithar you are happy to give to others, even if you have to sacrifice for the sake of your brother or sister. And this is when iman really enters the person's heart. When the iman is truly in the person's heart and the person is now concentrating on trying to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is concentrating on the hereafter, not on this dunya, and sees his brothers and sisters, and in fact even all of humanity, but sees his brothers and sisters and all of humanity not as a source of competition and hatred that you will dislike because they have more than you, but sees them as a means of furthering one's closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instead of being upset about what other people possess and what bounties Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to others, you should look towards others as a means of getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By behaving towards them in the proper way, you can please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So instead of wishing that they didn't have the bounties that they have, you should instead wish that they get more bounties and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses them in their bounties and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides them and Allah guides them to use their bounties properly. And when you have that feeling, you will be pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as I said, this is a characteristic of iman. This is a characteristic that should permeate the Muslim society, the society of the believers. Instead of being a society of hasad, where different members of the society are angry or upset that other people have bounties, Muslims should have a real love for one another for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when they have that real love for one another, they will love for each other what they love for themselves instead of al-hasad. And not only that, they will seek to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the best way that they can. And this means doing the good deeds before others can do it, so that they can please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this also means sacrificing for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and giving to others even when they are in need. This is the true nature of the one who has real iman in his heart. And we find this example among the Sahaba. We find it among those people who have this true iman in their hearts. We have gone now from stressing the emotions in the heart and realizing that they are acts of worship in the heart. There are definite acts of worship in the heart that are obligatory upon us, and at the same time there are diseases that can affect the heart, and we have to be very careful about these diseases. And one of the greatest of them is al-hasad. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك وأشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت وأستغفرك وأتوب إليك.